The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 1879, smudged with fingerprints and seawater stains, informing Yancey Oakes that his mail-order bride would be arriving in Galveston within 3 weeks, and he stood on his remote mountain property 200 miles northwest of the coastal city, wondering if he had made the greatest mistake of his 32 years of life. He had written to the matrimonial agency in Boston 6 months prior, describing himself honestly as a man who preferred solitude and mountains to crowds and flatlands, a trapper and hunter who had carved out an existence in the rugged hills west of Fort Worth. And now the reality of another human being sharing his isolated cabin felt both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. The journey to Galveston would take him 4 days of hard riding, and he would need to arrange lodging in town while he waited for the ship, expenses that would cut into his carefully saved funds. But the alternative was returning to his mountain alone for another winter. And after 10 years of that particular loneliness, he had decided some risks were worth taking. Yancey spent the next 2 weeks preparing the cabin with an attention to detail that surprised even himself, scrubbing floors that had not seen a proper cleaning in years, replacing the oilcloth on the single window with actual glass he purchased from a supply wagon passing through the nearest settlement, and building a proper bed frame to replace the pile of furs and blankets he had been sleeping on since he first arrived in these mountains. He hunted and smoked enough venison to last through the winter, checked his trap lines one final time, and left detailed instructions with his nearest neighbor, a grizzled former cavalry scout named Pete Henshaw who lived 8 miles east and who laughed outright when Yancey explained where he was going and why. The ride to Galveston was uneventful, taking him through rolling prairie that gradually flattened into coastal plains, past farms and ranches and small towns that grew larger and more frequent as he approached the Gulf. He had been to Galveston twice before, once as a young man of 22 when he first came to Texas from Missouri, and again 5 years later to sell a season's worth of premium furs. And both times the city had overwhelmed him with its noise and crowds, and the suffocating feeling of too many people pressed too close together. This time felt different, though, charged with an anticipation that made even the crowded streets seem less oppressive. And he found lodging at a modest boarding house near the docks, paying for a week in advance, and trying not to calculate how much of his savings was disappearing with each transaction. The ship was delayed by storms in the Atlantic, according to the harbor master, and what should have been a 3-day wait stretched into 8 days of pacing the waterfront, sleeping poorly in the unfamiliar bed, and spending far too much time wondering if the woman on that ship was having second thoughts about traveling halfway across a continent to marry a stranger. Yancey had never considered himself a particularly anxious man, but those 8 days taught him new definitions of worry, and by the time the merchant vessel finally appeared on the horizon on a gray afternoon with rain threatening, he felt hollowed out by the waiting, scraped raw by his own thoughts and doubts and fears that had nowhere to go except around and around in his head. The ship docked as the rain began in earnest, a cold October drizzle that blew sideways off the Gulf, and Yancey stood on the wharf with water running down his neck, watching passengers disembark down the gangplank with their trunks and cases, families reuniting and businessmen hurrying toward waiting carriages, and he was about to conclude that she had not come after all when he saw her. She was being helped down the gangplank by a ship's officer, one hand clutched to her stomach and the other gripping the rope rail so tightly her knuckles showed white even from a distance. And even through the rain he could see how pale she was, how unsteady her steps, how she looked like she might collapse at any moment. "Miss Violet Jensen," he called out, moving forward, and she turned her head slightly, green eyes enormous in her drawn face, and managed the smallest nod before her knees buckled. Yancey caught her before she hit the wet planks, one arm around her waist and the other under her knees, and she was so light he could feel her ribs through the layers of traveling dress and undergarments, so insubstantial it frightened him in a way he had not anticipated. She murmured something he could not hear over the rain and the shouts of the dock workers, and he carried her quickly toward the shelter of the nearest warehouse, the ship's officer following with her single trunk, concern written across his weathered face. "She has been ill the entire voyage," the officer said, setting the trunk down inside the warehouse entrance. "3 weeks of the worst seasickness I have seen in 30 years at sea. She could keep nothing down, barely any water. We thought we might lose her twice, once during the storm off Cape Hatteras and again in the Gulf. The ship's doctor did what he could, but she needs proper rest and care on land and quickly." Yancey looked down at the woman in his arms, at the dark circles under her eyes, and the way her skin seemed almost translucent, and felt a protective surge so fierce it shocked him. "I will take care of her," he said, and meant it with an intensity that went far beyond the practical arrangement he had imagined when he first wrote to the agency. The officer nodded, touched his cap and disappeared back into the rain, and Yancey was left holding this fragile stranger who was supposed to become his wife, trying to figure out his next move. The boarding house was out of the question. Mrs. Hargrove, who ran the establishment, had firm rules about unmarried men and women, and besides, Violet needed quiet and careful nursing, not the constant noise and bustle of a busy boarding house. Yancey settled her carefully on top of her trunk, keeping one hand on her shoulder to steady her, and considered his options. The 4-day journey back to his mountain cabin would likely kill her in her current condition. She needed time to recover, needed to be on solid ground after 3 weeks of being tossed on the ocean, needed food and water and rest, and all of that needed to happen before he could even think about the trip north. "Can you hear me?" he asked softly, crouching down so he could see her face. Her eyes opened, those startling green eyes, and she focused on him with visible effort. "I hear you," she whispered, her voice hoarse and accented with the soft vowels of somewhere back east, maybe Pennsylvania or New York. "Are you Yancey Oakes?" "I am," he confirmed, and felt an absurd relief that she at least knew who he was, that she had not come to the wrong place or the wrong man. "You are very sick. The officer said you have been seasick the entire voyage." 3 weeks, she breathed, and he saw tears gather in her eyes. "I have never been so ill. I thought I would die. I wished I would die. The ship never stopped moving, not once, and I could not eat, could not drink. Everything came back up, and the smell of the ship, the sounds, everything made it worse." "You are on land now," Yancey said firmly, taking her cold hand in his. "Solid, unmoving land. You will not go back on that ship. You are safe." Something in his tone seemed to reach her, because she squeezed his hand weakly and managed what might have been a smile. "Safe," she repeated, as if testing the word. "I have not felt safe in so long." The decision crystallized in that moment. Yancey could not take her north, not like this, not when she clearly needed weeks of recovery before she would be strong enough for such a journey. But he also could not stay in Galveston indefinitely, burning through his money while they waited. There had to be somewhere in between, somewhere he could take her where she could rest and recover, somewhere closer to his mountain, but still accessible enough that he could get supplies and help if she needed it. Desdemona, Texas, was 180 miles northwest of Galveston, a small town nestled in the rolling hills where the coastal plains began their gradual rise toward the Edwards Plateau. Yancey had passed through it on his way south, had noted the tidy buildings and the church with the white steeple and the general store that looked well-stocked and prosperous. More importantly, it was only 25 miles from his mountain cabin, close enough that he could bring her the rest of the way once she was stronger, but far enough from Galveston that the cost of staying there would not bankrupt him completely. "I am going to take you somewhere you can rest properly," he told Violet, and she nodded without opening her eyes, clearly beyond the point of making decisions for herself. "It will be a few days of travel, but we will go slowly, and we will stop as often as you need. Can you manage that?" "I will try," she whispered, and Yancey felt his heart clench at the exhaustion in those 3 small words. He purchased a small wagon and a sturdy horse to pull it, spending money that made him wince, but knowing there was no other option. He filled the wagon bed with straw and blankets, creating a nest where Violet could lie down during the journey, and loaded her trunk and his own supplies around the edges. The rain had stopped by the time he carried her out of the warehouse, and he settled her as gently as possible into the makeshift bed, tucking blankets around her thin frame and positioning a rolled coat under her head for a pillow. They left Galveston as the sun was setting, painting the Gulf in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost mocking in their beauty, and Yancey drove the wagon north through the gathering dusk, keeping the horse to a slow walk to minimize the jostling. Violet slept or lay unconscious behind him. He could not tell which, and he found himself turning around every few minutes to check that she was still breathing, still alive. This stranger he barely knew, but for whom he already felt responsible in ways that defied logic or reason. The first night, they stopped at a farm where Yancey paid the family for the use of their barn and a hot meal, and the farmer's wife took one look at Violet and immediately took charge, carrying her into the house despite Yancey's protests and putting her in an actual bed, feeding her tiny sips of broth and weak tea while clucking over her condition like a mother hen. In the morning, Violet looked slightly less corpse-like, with a hint of color in her cheeks and the ability to sit up for short periods, and the farmer's wife packed them a basket of food with instructions on what Violet should eat and how often. Advice Yancey accepted gratefully, even though he had no idea if he would be able to convince his patient to follow it. The second day passed much like the first, slow progress north with frequent stops, and by evening they had covered perhaps 30 miles, barely a quarter of the distance to Desdemona. Yancey found another farm willing to give them shelter, and this time Violet managed to walk from the wagon to the house under her own power, leaning heavily on his arm but moving nonetheless, and he took that as a good sign. She ate a few bites of bread soaked in milk, kept it down, and even spoke a few sentences before exhaustion claimed her again. "I am sorry," she said at one point, her hand finding his where he sat beside the borrowed bed. "This is not how I imagined our meeting. I wanted to be strong and healthy and ready to work, to be a proper wife, and instead I am weak as a kitten and useless." "You are not useless," Yancey said firmly, surprised by the vehemence in his own voice. "You survived 3 weeks of hell on that ship. You came all this way to a place you have never been, to marry a man you have never met, and you are still here, still fighting to get better. That is not weakness. That is strength." She had cried then, silent tears sliding down her temples, and Yancey had held her hand until she fell asleep, wondering at the strange turn his life had taken and realizing that somewhere in the past 2 days, this had stopped being merely a practical arrangement and had become something else entirely, something that felt dangerously like caring. By the 4th day of travel, Violet was able to sit on the wagon seat beside Yancey for a few hours at a time, bundled in blankets against the October chill, and they talked in the way of people learning each other from scratch. She told him about growing up in Boston, the youngest of 6 children in a family that had fallen on hard times after her father's shipping business failed, about working as a seamstress in a factory for wages that barely kept her fed, about answering the matrimonial agency's advertisement in a moment of desperate hope for something better. Yancey told her about Missouri and the family farm he had left at 20 to seek his fortune, about the mountains and the cabin, and the life he had built through 10 years of hard work and careful planning, about the loneliness that had finally driven him to seek a wife through the mail. "Are you disappointed?" Violet asked on the afternoon of the 5th day, when Desdemona was finally visible in the distance, a cluster of buildings rising from the amber grassland. "I am not what you expected, I am sure. Sick and weak and probably not very pretty right now." Yancey glanced at her, taking in the way the wind pulled strands of dark hair from her braid, the new strength in her posture, the intelligence and humor in those green eyes that were finally clear of pain and nausea. "No," he said honestly. "You are not what I expected. You are better." She blushed, the first time he had seen real color in her cheeks that was not fever or exertion, and looked away quickly, but not before he caught the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Desdemona was everything Yancey remembered. A prosperous little town serving the ranches and farms scattered through the surrounding hills, with a main street lined with businesses, a church, a school, and several boarding houses that catered to travelers and temporary workers. Yancey found a place called the Morning Star Hotel, run by a middle-aged widow named Mrs. Catherine Brooks, who took one look at Violet's condition and quoted him weekly rates that were more than reasonable, with meals included and a doctor available if needed. "How long will we stay here?" Violet asked that first evening, sitting in the rocking chair by the window of her small but clean room, and looking more relaxed than Yancey had seen her since Galveston. He had taken a room down the hall, and they had agreed to maintain the proprieties until Violet was strong enough to travel to the cabin, at which point they would find a preacher to marry them properly. "As long as you need," Yancey said, and meant it. 2 weeks, 3, however long it takes for you to be truly well again. There is no rush." But as the days passed and Violet grew steadily stronger, eating Mrs. Brooks' excellent cooking and sleeping 10 hours a night in the comfortable bed, Yancey found himself hoping she would need more time, found himself looking forward to their meals together and their walks around town as she regained her strength, found himself reluctant to face the moment when they would leave this pleasant interlude and return to the reality of his isolated mountain. It was a disconcerting feeling for a man who had always prized solitude above all else, and he did not quite know what to make of it. Violet, for her part, bloomed in the comfortable environment, gaining weight and color with each passing day, and Yancey found himself watching her with an attention that went well beyond simple concern for her health. She was lovely, he realized, with delicate features and expressive eyes and a laugh that came more frequently as she felt better. And she was also smart and funny and interested in everything around her, asking endless questions about Texas and the West and the life she would be living. They explored Desdemona together, visiting the general store where Yancey introduced her to the owner and his wife, attending Sunday service at the church, where the congregation welcomed the newcomer with genuine warmth, and walking along the creek that ran south of town, where cottonwoods turned gold in the autumn light. It was on one of these walks, 3 weeks after their arrival in Desdemona, that Violet asked the question Yancey had been both expecting and dreading. They were sitting on a fallen log by the creek, watching the water slide over smooth stones, and she turned to him with a serious expression that made his stomach tighten. "When will we leave for your cabin?" she asked directly, and Yancey heard both determination and uncertainty in her voice. "I am well now, as well as I was before I got on that ship, and you have been very patient, but I know staying here costs money you did not plan to spend. I do not want to be a burden." "You are not a burden," Yancey said automatically, but he knew she was right. Another week at the hotel would take the last of his carefully saved funds, and winter was coming fast. He needed to get back to his trap lines, needed to ensure everything was secure before the first snows came to the high country. They could not stay in Desdemona forever, no matter how much a part of him wished they could. "The journey to the cabin is not easy," he said carefully, watching her face. "It is 2 days of rough travel, most of it through country with no roads, no houses, no people. The cabin is remote, Violet. Very remote. The nearest neighbor is 8 miles away, and I only see him once or twice a month in good weather. In winter, I sometimes go weeks without seeing another human being. It is beautiful country, but it is hard country and it is lonely. If you have doubts, if you think this is not what you want, you should tell me now. I will not hold you to our arrangement. I can give you enough money to get back to Galveston, or to stay here in town and find other work, or whatever you choose. I will not trap you in a life you do not want." Violet was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the creek, and Yancey felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He realized with sudden clarity that he wanted her to say she would come with him, wanted it with an intensity that shocked him, but he also meant every word about letting her go if that was what she needed. "I was lonely in Boston," Violet said finally, her voice soft but steady. "Lonely in a room full of sisters, lonely in a factory full of other girls, lonely in a city of thousands of people. I have learned that loneliness is not about how many people are around you. It is about whether you matter to anyone, whether anyone sees you as you really are. These past 3 weeks, Yancey, you have seen me. You have been kind and patient and good, and you have asked nothing of me except that I get well. That means more than I can say. So yes, I will come to your mountain. I will be your wife, and we will make a life there together, and I do not think I will be lonely as long as you are there with me." Yancey took her hand, feeling the strength in her fingers, the calluses from years of factory work, and brought it to his lips. "I will always be there with you," he said, and it felt like a vow even though they had not yet stood before a preacher. "I promise you that." They found the circuit preacher 2 days later when he passed through Desdemona on his monthly rounds, and he married them in the little church with Mrs. Brooks and the general store owners as witnesses. A simple ceremony that lasted less than 10 minutes, but felt weightier and more real than Yancey had imagined anything could feel. Violet wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric purchased at the store, a simple blue cotton that matched her eyes, and when she smiled at him as the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Yancey felt something shift and settle in his chest, something that felt like coming home after a very long journey. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, in Yancey's room this time, and if their joining was tentative and careful, it was also tender and real, 2 people learning each other's bodies with patience and growing affection. And when Violet fell asleep in his arms afterward, her head on his chest and her breath warm against his skin, Yancey thought he had never felt so content in his entire life. They left Desdemona at dawn 2 days later, Yancey driving the wagon loaded with supplies and Violet's trunk, heading northwest into country that grew increasingly rugged as the coastal plains gave way to the first rocky ridges of the hill country. The November air was crisp and clean, scented with cedar and dry grass, and Yancey pointed out landmarks as they traveled, wanting Violet to know this country, to feel comfortable in it even as he recognized how different it was from anything she had known before. The first day they covered 20 miles, following a rough track that wound between hills covered with juniper and mesquite, and they camped that night under a sky so full of stars that Violet gasped when she stepped out of the firelight and looked up. Yancey made a simple meal of beans and cornbread, and they ate sitting close together on a log, shoulders touching, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that felt both new and natural. The second day they left the track entirely, following paths only Yancey could see, climbing steadily into higher country where limestone bluffs rose from the hillsides and springs bubbled from the rock to form clear pools before running away downhill. Violet rode beside him on the wagon seat, asking questions about the plants and animals they saw, interested in everything despite the rough journey. And Yancey found himself seeing the land through her eyes, appreciating its beauty anew through her wonder. They reached the cabin in late afternoon, coming around a bend in the narrow valley to where it sat on a small level area with a spring behind it, and a view down the valley that stretched for miles. Yancey pulled the wagon to a stop and looked at Violet, trying to gauge her reaction, and suddenly nervous in a way he had not been even on their wedding night. The cabin was small, just one room with a loft for sleeping, built of logs he had cut and hauled himself, chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney on one end and the new glass window catching the afternoon light. To him it represented 10 years of hard work and independence, but to someone from Boston, someone used to city comforts, it must look impossibly rustic and small. Violet climbed down from the wagon without saying anything, and Yancey's heart sank. She walked slowly toward the cabin, and he followed, ready to apologize, to explain, to promise he would add on rooms and make improvements. But before he could speak, she turned to him with tears streaming down her face and a smile so wide it transformed her features. "It is perfect," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yancey, it is absolutely perfect. Look at this view, look at those mountains, look at how peaceful it is. I have never seen anywhere so beautiful in my life." Relief flooded through him so intensely his knees felt weak. "You really like it?" "Like it?" Violet laughed and threw her arms around his neck. "I love it. I love that you built this with your own hands. I love that it is far from everything. I love that we will be alone here together. This is exactly what I hoped for when I got on that horrible ship. This is home." Yancey held her tight, his face buried in her hair, and felt something unclench in his chest that he had not even realized was tight. "Rest here forever," he said impulsively, the words coming from somewhere deep and unexamined. "Never leave again. This is your home now, our home, and you never have to go anywhere you do not want to go, never have to be on a ship or in a city or anywhere that makes you unhappy. Just rest here with me forever." Violet pulled back enough to look at him, her green eyes searching his face. "Do you mean that?" "Truly." "More than anything," Yancey said, and kissed her, tasting salt from her tears and feeling her melt against him. And in that moment, standing in front of his rough cabin with the mountains rising around them, he knew with absolute certainty that bringing her here had been the best decision of his life. The next weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and right to Yancey. His solitary bachelor existence transformed by Violet's presence in ways both large and small. She threw herself into making the cabin comfortable, unpacking her trunk to reveal the linens and curtains and small treasures she had brought from Boston, sewing cushions for the rough chairs from scraps of fabric, organizing the food supplies with an efficiency that impressed him, and cooking meals that were vastly superior to anything he had managed in 10 years of balking. She asked him to teach her about the land and the work he did, and he found himself explaining his trap lines and hunting patterns, showing her how to read weather signs and animal tracks, introducing her to the skills that had kept him alive and prosperous in this remote place. But it was the quiet moments that Yancey treasured most. The evenings sitting by the fire with Violet sewing or reading from one of the 3 books she had brought while he worked on equipment repairs. The mornings waking with her warm body curled against his in the loft. The walks they took together exploring the valley, and the surrounding ridges. She fit into his life like she had always been there, and he could no longer imagine what it had been like before she came, could not fathom how he had thought this solitary existence was enough. Winter came early that year, the first snow falling in mid-November and blanketing the mountains in white that would not fully melt until spring. Yancey had worried that the isolation and cold would frighten Violet or make her regret her choice, but instead she seemed to bloom, finding beauty in the stark winter landscape and coziness in their firelit evenings. She learned to snowshoe so she could accompany him on shorter trapline checks, learned to cure hides and render fat and all the other tasks that made up winter work in the mountains, and she never once complained about the cold or the isolation or the endless sameness of the white world outside their door. Pete Henshaw made his way over during a break in the weather in January, and his eyes widened comically when Yancey introduced him to Violet, taking in her capable manner and the obvious changes in the cabin, and the way Yancey hovered near her like a man afraid she might vanish if he looked away. Over coffee and pie that Violet had made from dried apples, Pete admitted he had not actually believed Yancey would go through with the mail-order bride scheme, had been certain he would come back alone and more confirmed in his solitary ways than ever. "I was wrong," Pete said simply, looking between them with something like respect. "You two fit. Anyone can see it. You are good for him, Mrs. Oakes, and unless I miss my guess, he is good for you too." "He is," Violet agreed, reaching over to take Yancey's hand. "He is the best man I have ever known." After Pete left, Yancey pulled Violet close and held her for a long time, thinking about how close he had come to not writing that letter, to accepting his loneliness as permanent and unchangeable, and feeling profound gratitude that he had taken the risk. Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow melting in fits and starts through March and April, and with the warming weather came new routines and new discoveries. Yancey cleared a plot near the spring, and Violet planted a vegetable garden with seeds she had ordered through the general store in Desdemona, optimistic about fresh produce come summer. They rode down to Desdemona once a month for supplies and to attend church, and Violet formed friendships with some of the town women, friendships conducted mostly through letters but real nonetheless. She wrote to her family in Boston too, long letters describing her new life and the husband she had found, and when letters came back from her sisters full of curiosity and a bit of envy at her adventure, she read them aloud to Yancey by the fire, and he saw the joy it gave her to maintain those connections. It was in May, with wildflowers covering the meadows and the creek running high with snowmelt, that Violet told him she was pregnant. They were sitting on the bench Yancey had built outside the cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple, and she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach and said simply, "There is a baby here, our baby. Due in December, I think." Yancey felt his throat close with emotion so strong it was almost painful. A baby. A child. The idea filled him with terror and joy in equal measure, and he pulled Violet into his arms and held her while she laughed at his reaction, clearly pleased by his obvious emotion. "Are you happy?" she asked, pulling back to see his face. "I know we have not been married very long, and perhaps it is too soon, but I cannot help being glad." "Too soon?" Yancey shook his head, cupping her face in his hands. "No, nothing about this is too soon. I am happier than I knew it was possible to be." "A baby, our baby. Violet, I love you. I should have said it before now, but I love you more than words can express." "I love you too," she said softly and kissed him. "I have loved you since you caught me on that dock in Galveston and promised I was safe. I did not know it yet, but I did. You are everything good in my life, Yancey Oakes, and I thank God every day that I was brave enough to answer that advertisement and get on that terrible ship. The summer passed in a haze of happiness and preparation. Yancey building a cradle from smooth pine and Violet sewing tiny clothes and blankets, both of them marveling at the changes in her body as the baby grew and made its presence known through kicks and movements that Yancey could feel when he placed his hand on her belly. They talked endlessly about names and futures, about whether they would have a son or daughter, about how they would raise a child in such an isolated place, and whether they would need to consider moving closer to town, once the baby was old enough to need schooling and other children for playmates. But those were problems for the future, and for now they existed in a bubble of contentment, working together through the days and falling into bed exhausted and satisfied each night. And Yancey thought often of his impulsive words that first day at the cabin, about how he had told her to rest here forever and never leave. She had done exactly that, had made this place her home in every possible way, and in doing so had transformed his life so completely that he barely recognized his former self, that lonely man who had thought solitude was enough. The baby came on a cold December night during the first major snowstorm of the winter, 3 weeks earlier than Violet had calculated, and Yancey had never been so frightened in his life. They had planned to be in Desdemona for the birth, staying at the hotel where the town doctor could attend, but the baby had other ideas, announcing its impending arrival with a rush of water and increasingly strong pains that made it clear there would be no time for the 2-day journey to town. Yancey rode through the beginning of the storm to fetch Pete Henshaw, who had helped with enough ranch births to have some idea what to do, and together they assisted Violet through 12 hours of labor that left all 3 of them exhausted and emotionally wrung out. But when the baby finally arrived just after dawn, a tiny red-faced boy with a powerful set of lungs and a full head of dark hair, Yancey forgot every moment of fear and worry in the overwhelming rush of love he felt for this impossibly small person. He cut the cord with shaking hands while Pete made sure Violet was all right, and then he placed the baby in her arms and watched her face transform with wonder and exhaustion and joy. And he knew that nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment, for the sheer intensity of feeling that came with holding his wife and son together. They named him William, after Violet's father, and called him Will from the start. Pete stayed another 2 days to make sure mother and baby were both doing well, and then rode back to his own place with instructions to return immediately if they needed anything, leaving the new family alone together in the cabin with the snow falling heavy outside and the fire burning warm inside. Those first weeks were an education in exhaustion and wonder, while needing to eat every few hours and neither Yancey nor Violet sleeping more than a few hours at a stretch. But even in the hardest moments, Yancey would not have traded places with anyone. He learned to change cloths and walk the floor with a fussy baby and help Violet with all the tasks that came with new motherhood. And he discovered reserves of patience and gentleness he had not known he possessed. Violet, for her part, took to motherhood with the same determination she had shown in adapting to mountain life, learning as she went and rarely complaining even when clearly exhausted. Winter passed slowly, marked by Will's gradual growth and development, and by the time spring arrived the baby had become a person, smiling and cooing and responding to their voices with obvious recognition and delight. Yancey found himself doing his outside work as quickly as possible so he could get back to the cabin, not wanting to miss any moment of his son's development, and Violet teased him gently about being completely besotted with fatherhood, but he could see she was pleased by his involvement. They made it to Desdemona in April, wanting to show off Will to the community and to have him properly baptized at the church. And the reception they received was warmly enthusiastic. The town women clustering around to admire the baby and the men clapping Yancey on the back and offering congratulations and unsolicited advice about raising boys. Mrs. Brooks at the hotel insisted on hosting a small celebration, and people brought gifts of clothing and blankets and toys, and Yancey was struck by how much their little family had become part of this community, despite living so far from town. The years that followed fell into a pattern of seasons and growth, while thriving in the mountain environment, learning to walk and talk and eventually to ride and help with simple chores. Clearly his father's son in his love of the outdoors and his comfort with animals and wild places. When he was 4, Violet became pregnant again, and this time they made arrangements to be in Desdemona for the birth, staying at the hotel for the last month and having a much easier time with the arrival of their daughter Evelyn, whom they called Evie from the start. 2 years later came their second son, Thomas, called Tom, and 2 years after that their youngest daughter Alice, and suddenly the cabin was full to bursting with children and noise, and the complicated logistics of raising 4 young people in a remote location. Yancey added 2 rooms to the cabin, working through a summer with the older children helping as they could, and Violet somehow managed to keep everyone fed and clothed and educated, teaching them letters and numbers at the kitchen table, and reading to them every evening from a growing collection of books they accumulated through careful saving and occasional trips to town. It was a hard life in many ways, demanding constant work and adaptation, but it was also rich in ways Yancey could never have imagined during his solitary years. The children grew strong and capable, learning the skills they needed to thrive in the mountains while also getting enough education to make their way in the wider world if they chose. Will developed into a skilled hunter and tracker by his early teens, already talking about taking over his father's traplines someday. Evie had her mother's quick mind and love of learning, begging for more books whenever they went to town and teaching herself to read anything she could get her hands on. Tom was the steady one, reliable and hardworking and content with simple pleasures, while Alice was the wild card, fearless and adventurous, and always getting into scrapes that gave her parents gray hairs. Through it all, Yancey and Violet's bond deepened and strengthened, tested by the challenges of raising children in isolation but never breaking. And Yancey often thought back to that moment on the Galveston dock, when he had caught her falling and felt his life change direction in an instant. They had built something remarkable together, a family and a home and a life that worked despite, or perhaps because of its remoteness and simplicity. On their 15th wedding anniversary, a clear October day that reminded Yancey of that first journey to Galveston, he and Violet rode up to the high meadow above the cabin, leaving the children under Will's supervision for a few hours, and sat together on a flat rock overlooking the valley. The aspens were turning gold, and the air had that particular clarity that comes only in autumn, and Yancey held his wife's hand and thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. "You ever regret it?" he asked, the question that had lived in the back of his mind for 15 years finally spoken aloud. "Getting on that ship, coming here, all of it. Do you ever wish you had made different choices?" Violet was quiet for a moment, and Yancey felt his stomach tighten, but when she turned to him her eyes were clear and certain. "Never," she said firmly. "Not once. Yes, the journey was horrible, and yes, there have been hard times, lonely times, scary times. But Yancey, you gave me everything I needed. You told me to rest here forever, to never leave, and I did, and in doing so I found a life I did not know was possible. I found love and family and purpose and beauty, and I found myself in a way I never could have in Boston. I would go through those 3 weeks of seasickness 100 times over if it meant ending up here with you. I love you, Yancey said, his voice rough with emotion. I have loved you since that first day, and I will love you until my last breath. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Violet Oakes. You and our children and this life we have built. All of it started because you were brave enough to answer an advertisement, and I was brave enough to mail a letter. And because you caught me when I fell, Violet added, leaning against his shoulder. You have been catching me ever since in all the ways that matter. That is what love is, I think, catching each other when we fall and holding on tight. They sat together as the sun moved across the sky, talking and remembering and planning for the future. And when they finally rode back down to the cabin as evening was falling, they found the children had made supper together, a slightly chaotic meal of burned biscuits and oversalted stew, but made with love and good intentions. The family sat around the table together, talking and laughing and arguing in the way of families. And after the children were finally settled for the night and the cabin was quiet, Yancey pulled Violet into his arms in the privacy of their room and held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. The years continued to pass, marked by the steady rhythm of seasons and the gradual growing up of the children. Will did eventually take over most of the trap lines when Yancey's knees started bothering him in his late 40s, but the young man built his own cabin just 2 miles from his parents' place, staying close and bringing his eventual wife, a rancher's daughter from near Desdemona, to meet the family with obvious pride. Evie went to normal school in Fort Worth at 16, determined to become a teacher, and came back 2 years later to take a position at the school in Desdemona, boarding in town during the week but riding up to the mountain every weekend. Tom found work on a large ranch south of town and fell in love with the foreman's sister, marrying her in a ceremony at the Desdemona church with the whole family in attendance, and they settled into a small house on the ranch property, close enough to visit often. Only Alice showed signs of wanting to go farther, talking about California and the Pacific Ocean and places beyond Texas, but she was still young, and there would be time enough for such adventures. Yancey and Violet grew older together with the grace of people who had made peace with life, their hair turning gray and their bodies showing the accumulated effects of hard work and mountain living. But their love remained constant and warm, deepened by decades of shared experience and mutual respect. They became grandparents as their children married and had babies of their own, and the cabin that had once been a place of solitary survival became the gathering place for an extended family, full of noise and laughter during holidays and celebrations. On a summer evening when Yancey was 58 and Violet 54, they sat together on the bench outside the cabin, the same spot where they had sat so many times over the years, and watched the sun set over the mountains in a spectacular display of color. Their hands were clasped together, fingers intertwined with the unconscious ease of long habit, and they were quiet in the comfortable way of people who no longer needed words to communicate. "I was thinking today about that dock in Galveston," Violet said eventually, her voice soft in the evening stillness. "About how sick I was, how weak and frightened, and how you just scooped me up and took charge and made everything better." "Do you remember?" "Every detail," Yancey confirmed. "I remember thinking you might die. You were so pale and thin. I remember carrying you and feeling how light you were and being terrified I would not be able to save you. I remember the exact moment I knew I loved you, on the second day of traveling to Desdemona, when you apologized for being sick, and I realized I would do anything to keep you safe. I knew I loved you when you told me I could leave if I wanted," Violet said. when we were sitting by the creek in Desdemona, and you said you would not trap me in a life I did not want. That was when I knew you were truly good, truly honorable, and that I wanted to spend my life with you." "And here we are," Yancey said, gesturing to the mountains around them, to the cabin behind them, to the whole life they had built. 26 years later, 4 children, 6 grandchildren so far, and a love that has only grown stronger. "When I told you to rest here forever and never leave, I meant it with my whole heart. This was always meant to be your home, Violet, our home, and it has been the greatest joy of my life to share it with you." "And it will continue to be our home," Violet said firmly, squeezing his hand. "Until we are both too old to climb the ridge and our children have to come take care of us. Even then, I would not want to be anywhere else. You gave me exactly what you promised, Yancey. A place to rest, a place to belong, a place where I never have to leave. And you gave me your heart, which was the greatest gift of all." Yancey turned to her and kissed her softly. This woman who had traveled across an ocean and a continent to find him, who had survived seasickness and hardship, and all the challenges of frontier life to build something beautiful with him. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers and closed his eyes, feeling complete and content in a way that still sometimes surprised him even after all these years. Inside the cabin, they could hear their youngest granddaughter laughing at something, the sound pure and joyful, and Yancey smiled. This was what mattered, he thought. Not wealth or status or any of the things the world said defined success, but this. A hand to hold, a family to love, a place to call home, and someone who had chosen to rest here forever and never leave. He had been lonely once, had thought solitude was all he needed, but Violet had taught him differently. She had shown him that the right kind of love, the deep and abiding kind built on respect and trust and genuine affection, was worth any risk, any change, any leap into the unknown. As the last light faded from the western sky and the first stars began to appear overhead, Yancey Oakes, formerly a lonely mountain man and now a husband and father and grandfather, pulled his wife close and thanked whatever forces of fate or luck or providence had brought a seasick young woman from Boston into his life and transformed it so completely. Tomorrow there would be work to do, as there always was, but tonight there was only this: peace, love, and the certain knowledge that he had found exactly what he had been searching for all those years ago when he first came to these mountains, even though he had not known he was searching for it at all. The cabin behind them glowed with warm lamplight, and from somewhere in the gathering darkness an owl called, and Yancey felt Violet relax against him with a sigh of pure contentment. They sat together as night fell completely, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment, and when they finally rose and went inside to their family and their life, they did so hand in hand, partners in all things, just as they had been since that rainy day in Galveston when a mountain man caught a falling woman, and both their lives changed forever in the very best way possible.